Now, here's Michael Smerconish.
Palin v. New York Times. Palin v. New York Times. It may go to trial in a week or thereafter. Very rare that a high-profile plaintiff, such as former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin, actually gets into a courtroom and litigates a defamation action. But this one may come to pass, and I'm fascinated by it. In 2020, my guest, Bill Grueskin, who is on faculty at Columbia Journalism School, wrote for the Columbia Journalism Review a very deep dive, well-done investigation into what's this case all about. His piece is in all of my social media today. It's posted at Smerconish.com. I've just tweeted it. It made the newsletter this morning as well. Bill, thank you so much for being here. Can I begin with your credentials? You've had a very interesting journalism career. Founding editor of a newspaper on the Standing Rock Sioux Indian Reservation, city editor of the Miami Herald, deputy managing editor of the Wall Street Journal, and executive editor of Bloomberg News. So thank you so much for being here to shed your unique perspective on this case.
Thanks very much for having me, Michael. I look forward to hearing your questions and going over in any way I can help you.
Well, let's go to the predicate facts, because as you wrote for the CJR, Palin's lawsuit stems from an editorial on the shootings, and people will remember this as I describe, of GOP Congressman Steve Scalise and several others during a June 2017 baseball practice in Alexandria, Virginia. The gunman was a Bernie Sanders supporter. He was ultimately killed by police. What happened thereafter?
Sure. Well, so when the shooting happened, obviously it took us all by surprise. It was a shocking event. And, you know, I think one thing to establish early on is the issue the New York Times has is not with their news coverage of the shooting. Their news coverage was right down the line. They reported the facts as they knew them. They didn't make any unusual leaps. The problem the New York Times has is with an editorial that the Times ran that night. And it's what we in the news business call a house editorial, which means that it is not signed. It isn't an op-ed by Tom Friedman or Maureen Dowd. It's one of those editorials that appears in print on the left side of the page. It doesn't have any name on it, and it represents the kind of institutional wisdom of the New York Times editorial page.
And in this case, what was the subject matter?
So basically what happened, and you know, as you noted, this happened 4 or 5 years ago. So a lot of the details of this case, in a very unusual way, are now public, thanks to all kinds of depositions and emails and texts and that kind of thing that are in the public record, which was the gist of my Columbia Journalism Review piece. What happened was people on the editorial page shortly after the shooting occurred started emailing amongst each other saying, should we have a live editorial tonight that represents our point of view on this thing? And, you know, Michael, the problem with a piece like this is, what do you say? You know, I mean, everybody knows this is bad. People shouldn't be shooting congressmen, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or libertarians. And it's, as you see in many of the emails that lead up to the disastrous conclusion here, the people on the editorial page are kind of scratching their heads trying to figure out what the hell are we going to write about this that's going to take a point of view. And one of the editorial page writers, who's based in the Washington D.C. bureau, said, "Let me take a stab." This is a journalist named Elizabeth Williamson, somebody I overlapped with at the Wall Street Journal, just a terrific reporter. She's reported overseas as well in the United States. She actually has a new book out, which I'm not here to plug it, and it's not about this case, but it's about the Connecticut school shootings. So she sent in a draft of an editorial, and it was fine. I mean, honestly, I'm sure she wouldn't say it was her best work. It was a pretty garden variety, this is a sad day in American politics kind of opinion piece. And it came in kind of towards the end of the afternoon. And keep in mind, the editorial page is dealing with deadlines. That they have print deadlines as well as online deadlines. And James Bennett, who at that point was the editorial page editor, saw it and said, and I'm putting words in his mouth, but essentially I need to goose this up a little bit. It doesn't really have a point of view to it. And he did, and as somebody who's been an editor, as you know, for a long time, I've seen this happen many times. He decided I'm going to do what we call a write through in the journalism business, where I'm going to take her text and I'm going to write through it and make it the way I think it should read, which is something editors do all the time. And in the process of doing that, he attributed in the process of doing that, he brought up the Arizona shooting 6 years earlier of Gabby Giffords in the Arizona shopping center. And you might remember that was a much more grievous incident. 6 people were murdered, including a federal judge and a 9-year-old girl. Giffords herself was suffered grievous injuries that she's still recovering from. The death toll of that was much worse. And at the time, there were some hints that maybe the gunman was incited by a map that Sarah Palin's Political Action Committee had put out with crosshairs on a number of congressional districts, targeting them, not for assassination, but for being replaced by Congress people that Palin approves of. I should also say, shortly after that theory was raised back in 2011 or so, it was dismissed because the gunman in the Arizona case, there was no connection. But that didn't seem to faze James Bennett, the editorial page editor of the Times. And on deadline, in a rush, he put in several lines that attributed the shooting to political incitement and linked it to Sarah Palin's map. And without going into too much detail, that editorial just kind of ran on the page, because as we know, when the top editor wants something in the paper, it tends to go in the paper. And almost immediately after it went online, at the same time it was in print, Twitter exploded because many people, and not just conservatives, even Chris Hayes, were weighing in publicly saying, this is nuts, this is not true. And at that point, with print deadlines, it was too late. That thing was already rolling off the presses. There was nothing they could do about it. And one thing led to another. And within a couple of weeks, Palin filed her lawsuit alleging defamation of character.
And so in a grossly simplistic form, I would say Sarah Palin is saying, New York Times, you have blamed me for these gunmen. You have said that this map of my Sarah pack is the reason they acted. And in fact, that wasn't the case in either instance.
That was not the case. And what Palin was saying was, in doing so, you have defamed my character. You have cost me, grievous injury, both emotionally and financially. And New York Times, you're going to have to pay me a lot of money.
The New York Times did, after publishing the original editorial, write a correction. If you go and look today at that editorial, it's still online. Correction, June 16, 2017, an editorial on Thursday about the shooting of Representative Steve Scalise incorrectly stated that a link existed between political rhetoric and the 2011 shooting of Representative Gabby Giffords. In fact, no such link was established. The editorial also incorrectly described a map distributed by a political action committee before the shooting. It depicted electoral districts, not individual Democratic lawmakers, beneath stylized crosshairs. So what is the mountain that Sarah Palin as a plaintiff must surmount in order to be successful? What is actual malice?
So, and with the caveat that my law degree comes from the Twitter University School of Law, I don't want to go into this, but I know a little bit about media law, especially here in the United States. And thanks to a 1960s case called Times versus Sullivan, public figures have to jump a couple extra hurdles if they're going to have a successful defamation suit. They have to show either that the reporter acted with actual malice, meaning the reporter sat down and said, I'm going to get this guy, and I don't care if the facts are true or not, which is really hard to prove. or they have to show that the reporter show what they call a reckless disregard for the facts. Basically, that the reporter just didn't care what was true or not. They were just throwing the whole kitchen sink into the editorial. And that's a standard that applies to what are called public figures, basically people who, so if it's a cashier at the Circle K store, that person wouldn't have to mount that hurdle. Sarah Palin is by any definition a public figure, and neither she nor her lawyers have tried to argue that she's not. And it's usually an almost insurmountable hurdle in the United States because the Supreme Court felt at the time that to have a robust and free press, journalists are going to screw up sometimes. And when they're writing about prominent people, particularly government officials, that kind of thing, they need to be given a little bit of extra leeway, or they will be so overly cautious that they won't do the kind of journalism that our founders had in mind when they wrote the First Amendment.
In other words, Bill, the Times got it wrong in this case. The Times clearly got it wrong in this case, but that's not enough for Sarah Palin. If Sarah Palin were not a public figure, there'd be a simple negligence standard that would apply, but she is a public figure. And by the way, the logic of New York Times versus Sullivan or the Carol Burnett case or the whole slew of cases, I think are very reasonable. And what they assume is that if you're a public figure, and this is pre-internet, you have access to a platform in a way that a non-public figure does not, and you can defend yourself. Right. Therefore, it's going to be more difficult for you to be successful as a litigant. Actual malice is knowledge of falsity, I don't think in this case, or reckless disregard for the truth. And when you wrote for CJR, the Columbia Journalism Review, you said, in recent days, I have reviewed deposition statements, story drafts, emails, texts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You describe the documents as a showcase of a series of errors. Do you think there's a prospect that it could rise to the level of recklessness?
I want to be careful because I don't want to, prejudice jurors or anything along those lines. It is clear that Bennett, in rewriting the editorial and slamming it into the paper that night, did not adhere to common journalism standards. I would put it that way. That basically, if you're going to be putting things into, especially such a prominent thing as a House editorial on the New York Times editorial page, you want to have somebody who actually checks every single fact before it goes in. And I'm going to say this was not an ambiguous thing. This is not like writing about COVID cases and trying to, do they die with COVID or because of COVID or anything like that. This is unambiguously false. And there's a trail of stories leading up to Bennett's editorial that actually approached this issue and said, did Palin's map have a role in the horrendous Arizona shooting? And the conclusion of every one of them is either no, or at least there is no evidence to demonstrate that it's true. So it was an easily checkable thing, and the fact that it wasn't checked will strengthen Palin's argument that there was reckless disregard for the truth.
Do you see any evidence in the record that you reviewed of malice? And I don't mean it in a legal sense, but of animosity, hostility toward Palin in the email back and forth, in any of the drafts, anything like that?
The material I saw, and again, this is material that was put into the court docket a year or two ago, so there may be new elements that are going to come out during trial. But the elements that I saw, there was nothing along the lines of, oh, this is our chance to get Sarah Palin, or I know this is false, but I've always wanted to write something false about Sarah Palin. There's nothing like that at all.
That is what I was asking.
Right, and whether there will be testimony that will help establish that or something along those lines. I will say that one of the things that Palin's team is trying to do is to go way back into Bennett's past, back when he was editor of the Atlantic, and to find pieces that the Atlantic ran back around 2010 or 2011 that were kind of anti-Sarah Palin, more on a political level. And they're trying to bring those up in trial to show that Bennett, the editorial page editor, had a longstanding animus against Palin. The New York Times is fighting that right now. The court docket, I just checked it this morning, it's just filled with motions trying to keep this stuff out of trial. And I think that's a bunch of thin ice. I mean, Palin's a very controversial character, and if you're the editor of the Atlantic magazine in 2008 or 2009 or 2010, you're probably going to run some negative pieces about Sarah Palin. It's just, I mean, that's just who she is. And so, so there's the Times actually in its most recent motion said they're trying to throw the kitchen sink into this. And that's what leads me to believe that there's kind of a PR element to this on Palin's point of view, and maybe some conservative supporters, which is, it's a wonderful opportunity to put the New York Times on its heels and show that they don't adhere to great standards.
Bill Grueskin, that was well done. What a great summary, for which I thank you. If it goes next week or thereafter, it's going to be really interesting to watch.
It'll be one of the most fascinating libel/defamation suits that we've had in many years. So.
I agree with that. Thank you so much. That was excellent. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Michael. It was great being on your show. Take care.